and bloody American Civil War finally came to an end in 1865. Over 4 million enslaved black men, women, and children became free officially in the United States. These newly freed black men and women could own their plantations, farm their land, or engage in trade as skilled artisans and other means of revenue generation in the country. So let's first find out if the blacks who had recently been freed could be worth $1.3 billion. Before slavery was abolished, some enslaved blacks who were engaged in trades and other paid labor had savings with their owners, since black slaves were not allowed to have bank accounts. Also, about 180,000 black Americans and escaped slaves who fought for the Union were paid for their service, though less than what the white soldiers received. In addition, General William T. Sherman had issued a directive for the redistribution of 400,000-acre plots confiscated from Confederate landowners to the 4 million freed slaves. This made the blacks have quite a significant amount of money and assets in their possession, but less exposure to private enterprise. So some of the freed blacks turned to sharecropping and forced labor in the South. More so, only a few banks at this time would let a free black person open an account and safeguard their money. These were military banks created during the Civil War to collect the wages of black soldiers. General Rufus Saxton established the first one in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1864. Other examples include a bank in Norfolk, Virginia, established by General Benjamin Butler in late 1864, and a bank in Louisiana created by General Nathaniel Banks. However, when the war ended, one of the banks still had $200,000 left unclaimed because the soldiers who had deposited had either died and relatives could not be found, or they had been transferred to other posts or mustered out of service and had not realized they could withdraw the funds. The banking system and its operations were still new to the freed slaves at this time. It became necessary for the blacks to have a safe and legal means of saving their cash and other monetary assets since they were free citizens. John Alvord, a white abolitionist preacher from New York, diplomatically lobbied Congress during the Reconstruction era to establish a bank for the gallant soldiers and the millions of former slaves to save their money and access other financial transactions and benefits available. By March 1865, President Abraham Lincoln signed into law an act that established Freedmen's Saving and Trust Company, also known as Freedmen's Bank. It became the first bank with free access to the blacks in the United States. In the bank's first year, 2 of the branches established were created through the transfer of existing local military savings institutions. Many other branch locations were chosen specifically based on the local black soldier population. Bank officials made efforts to build the bank's legitimacy and deposits, raising part of the black soldiers' wages. For example, many cashiers at branches also worked as military dispersing officers. At this time, account holders had between $5 and $50. From 1865 to the early 1870s, the banks had expanded across 17 states and Washington, D.C., with 37 branches holding funds or savings from over 72,000 black depositors. This was achieved through persistent outreach to churches, schools, and other gatherings of the blacks to encourage them on savings and account openings. 15,000 copies of newspapers were also shared across all branches to enhance the advertisement. Each account holder was issued a passbook that recorded deposits and withdrawals. Shockingly, the depositor signature books of the surviving Freedmen's Bank records are virtually mini biographies of the people who applied for a savings account. This book contains information about the applicant's former slave owner, the person's spouse, and children, while the personal details, line skills, personal injuries, etc., were available separately. No doubt, this document can be a perfect research material for blacks to search for their slave ancestors. Meanwhile, the 72,000 black depositors were less than 5% of the over million black population in the United States. Notwithstanding, this unprecedented achievement of Freedmen's Bank was largely driven by the money collected from black soldiers and the freed blacks. The bank at this time had received $3.7 million in deposits from black account holders who believed that the government bank had their backs. Unfortunately, Freedmen's Bank didn't. Do you know why? Freedmen's Bureau and Freedmen Bank were separate institutions. They were portrayed as being the same to solicit more deposits into the bank. In the real sense, the Freedmen's Bureau was a government-owned institution, while the Freedmen's Bank was a private institution and not protected by the government. The bank's existence had been granted by Congress, but the depositors' funds were not insured by Congress. But this detail was unknown to the blacks when the bank officers embarked on marketing and sensitization to encourage them to deposit their money. By implication, this hidden fact made the depositors' investment not completely safe. It was also unknown to the blacks that the management of the bank was under the control of whites who were businessmen and politicians. Although the intention was a good one, and the bank recorded tremendous gains, being the first bank in the South to help the freed people of color. Through this bank, the literacy rate increased, and blacks were exposed to investment and other meaningful job opportunities. However, in less than a decade, Freedmen's Bank collapsed due to fraudulent activities of the financial experts who were hired to oversee the banking operations. Worst of all, the bank management and the experts approached Congress to grant an order for the bank to issue a loan to individuals or companies with collateral worth double the loan. This was granted, but the bank violated the order. The trustees now began to invest in real estate projects, railroads, and gambling, which were new inventions. They granted risky loans to friends, some with no collateral. Some of the trustees were in charge of other banks as well, and when they made bad loans at those banks, they transferred the bad loans to Freedmen's Bank. For instance, Henry D. Cook, the brother to Jay Cook, the founder of Jay Cook & Company, got a loan of $500,000, on which the Cook brothers paid a 5% interest instead of 6%. Seneca Sandstone Company also secured a loan of $50,000 without due procedures. The corrupt bankers also stole people's hard-earned money. The contractor for the bank's building in Washington, D.C., Robert I. Fleming, got loans totaling $224,000 and other individuals. Meanwhile, these loans were issued to the whites from the deposits of the African Americans. The bank became the black man's cow, but the white man's milk. Unfortunately, the European market crashed shortly after massive investment in bonds by most businesses in the U.S. Investors began to sell off the investments they had in American projects, particularly railroads. Back in those days, railroads were a new invention, and companies had been borrowing money to get the cash they needed to build new lines. Railroad companies borrowed using bonds, which were debt securities specifying how much a company was borrowing and how much interest it would pay. When a financial panic hit the country in 1873, most of the Freedmen's Bank's investments lost value or became worthless. The bank was doomed. Several branches were hit by bank runs, during which crowds of depositors demanded their money. The branches met demands, but the cash reserves of the Freedmen's Bank were drained. Several trustees resigned. By this time, Jay Cook & Company had already collapsed. The trustees asked Frederick Douglass to replace the bank president, but 6 after he realized the mess and scandals couldn't be resolved. He advised the bank to be closed, and by June 1874, the Freedmen's Bank was closed. The bank had a total of 483,082 account holders, roughly 12% of the black population in the American South. Shortly after, 3 commissioners were appointed to wind down the bank. They found that the value of assets was lower than registered in the bank books. Liquid assets, cash, and government securities amounted to less than 2% of the bank's total liabilities. By this time, the bank owed 61,144 depositors $2,993,790, but had $32,089 in cash. The rest was in personal and real estate loans that could only be realized after a long delay. Eventually, only a few of the depositors were paid. The rest amount in the billions were stolen and invested in dead bonds. Most individuals lost every penny they had saved. No doubt the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank and the loss of savings have contributed to an intergenerational mistrust of banks and a tremendous blow to the black communities. Despite the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank and the shock experienced by the ex-slaves, they took pride in the bank's initial existence and achievement, as it demonstrated that ex-slaves could not make it on their own. While it may be challenging to directly attribute a monetary value of $1.3 billion to this ongoing theft, the cumulative impact cannot be disregarded. Thanks for being a part of this journey. Don't forget to like, subscribe to this channel, and share your opinion. With the passage of the Civil Rights Law in 1960,